The Montana night pressed down like a cold iron weight, and Sarah Mitchell pulled her mother's shawl tighter around her shoulders as she made her way to the woodpile behind the cabin. November had arrived early and bitter this year, bringing snow that transformed the valley into a landscape of white silence. Her breath came out in clouds, and her fingers already ached from the cold despite her wool gloves. She was 16 years old and had been alone for 9 months, ever since pneumonia claimed both her parents during the previous winter. The cabin felt too big now, too quiet, with only the crackling of the fire and the occasional howl of wind through the mountain passes to break the silence. Some days she talked to herself just to hear a human voice, even if it was only her own. Sarah had just reached the woodpile when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the wilderness. Metal scraping against metal, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere beyond the tree line. She froze, her hand hovering over a split log. Out here, unexpected sounds could mean danger. Wolves, bears, or worse, desperate men driven to the edge by the harsh territory. The sound came again, followed by something else. A low groan, barely human, filled with pain. Sarah's first instinct was to run back to the cabin, bar the door, and pretend she'd heard nothing. That's what her mother would have told her to do. But her father's voice echoed in her memory, words he'd spoken countless times while teaching her to track and hunt. Listen to what the land tells you, Sarah, and never ignore someone who needs help. She left the wood and moved carefully through the snow toward the sound, her boots crunching with each step. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the frozen landscape and making the shadows deeper where the pines grew thick. As she rounded a dense cluster of trees, she saw it, an old military supply wagon half hidden in the shadows, one wheel broken and listing to the side like a wounded animal. The scraping sound came from inside the wagon. Sarah approached slowly, every muscle tense and ready to run. When she reached the back of the wagon and peered over the wooden gate, her breath caught in her throat. A man lay chained inside, his wrists and ankles bound with heavy iron manacles connected to the wagon's frame. He wore buckskin leggings and a shirt that had once been decorated with quillwork, but was now torn and stained with blood. His long black hair was matted and dirty, and even in the moonlight Sarah could see the dark bruises covering his face and arms. He'd been beaten badly and left here. The man's eyes opened, dark and feverish, and fixed on her. For a moment neither of them moved. Then he spoke, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "Water." Sarah knew she should leave. She knew that helping him could bring trouble down on her like an avalanche. The tensions between settlers and the native tribes had reached a breaking point this year. Fort Sullivan, 15 miles north, was constantly sending out patrols. There had been skirmishes, accusations, fears whispered in the general store about uprisings and revenge. But all she saw was a man dying of thirst, chained like an animal and abandoned in the freezing cold. "Wait here," she said, then immediately felt foolish. He was chained to a wagon. Where would he go? Sarah ran back to the cabin, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. She grabbed a clay jug of water and a hunk of bread from yesterday's baking, then paused. If she was going to do this, she needed to do it right. She took her father's old tools from the shed, a hammer and a heavy chisel he'd used for splitting stubborn logs. When she returned to the wagon, the man's eyes had closed again. For a terrible moment she thought he'd died, but then she saw his chest rise and fall, shallow but steady. "I brought water," Sarah said softly, "and food. Can you sit up?" It took him several tries, each movement accompanied by a grunt of pain. Sarah helped him as much as she could, positioning herself so he could lean against the wagon's side. She held the jug to his cracked lips, and he drank in desperate gulps, water spilling down his chin. When he'd drunk his fill, she offered the bread. He ate slowly, his hands shaking from cold or weakness or both. Sarah studied him in the moonlight. He was probably in his mid-20s, tall and powerfully built despite the obvious signs of starvation and injury. The chains on his wrists had rubbed the skin raw, leaving angry red wounds that looked infected. "Who did this to you?" Sarah asked. The man finished chewing before answering. "Soldiers. From Fort Sullivan. Captain Thorne." Sarah had heard that name before. Captain Edmund Thorne had arrived at the fort 6 months ago, brought in to maintain order in the territory. The stories about him varied. Some said he was a hero, others that he was cruel beyond measure. Looking at the man chained in this wagon, Sarah was beginning to believe the latter. Why did they chain you? What did you do?" The man met her eyes, and despite his weakened state, his gaze was steady and clear. "I saw something I was not supposed to see, so they decided I would not see anything ever again." "What do you mean?" "They were going to kill me." "Tomorrow morning," Captain Thorne said. "Make it look like I tried to escape." He gestured weakly at the chains, but the wagon broke. "The soldiers could not fix it in the dark. They left me here, said they would return at dawn to finish the job." Dawn was only a few hours away. Sarah looked at the chains, at the heavy padlock securing them. "I don't have keys," she said, "but I can try to break the locks. Why would you do this?" The man asked. "You do not know me. Helping me will bring danger to you." It was the same question Sarah had been asking herself. "What's your name?" she asked instead of answering. "Two Rivers. My mother named me this because I was born where two streams meet. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and I'm helping you because leaving you here to die would make me no better than the people who chained you." She positioned the chisel against the first padlock. "Now hold still. This is going to be loud." The sound of metal striking metal rang out across the frozen valley like a bell. Sarah struck again and again, each blow sending vibrations up her arms. The first lock held stubbornly, but the second one, older and more rusted, finally gave way with a sharp crack. Two Rivers' ankles were free. Sarah moved to his wrists, working on the manacles that bound him to the wagon's frame. Sweat ran down her back despite the cold, and her arms burned with effort. Finally, with a sound like breaking teeth, the third lock shattered. Two Rivers pulled his hands free, wincing as blood flow returned to his numb fingers. The manacles still circled his wrists. Sarah couldn't remove those without proper tools. But at least he was no longer chained to the wagon. "Can you walk?" Sarah asked. Two Rivers tried to stand and immediately collapsed back against the wagon, his legs unable to support his weight. "Not yet," he admitted. "They have not fed me in 3 days. My strength is gone." Sarah looked toward the eastern horizon. Still dark, but dawn was coming. "The soldiers will be back soon. You can't be here when they arrive." "Then I will die somewhere else," Two Rivers said with a calmness that startled her. "At least I will die free thanks to you." "No," Sarah said firmly. "You're not dying." "Not if I can help it." She had no idea how she was going to save him. Her cabin was only 200 yards away, but he couldn't walk and she couldn't carry him. The soldiers would search the area when they found him missing. They'd check every building, every shelter within miles, unless they had no reason to check. An idea formed in Sarah's mind. Dangerous. Possibly foolish, but it was all she had. "Listen to me," she said urgently. "My cabin has a root cellar deep and well hidden. If I can get you there before the soldiers come, they might not find you. But you have to trust me, and you have to do exactly what I say." Two Rivers studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I trust you, Sarah Mitchell. You have already risked more for me than anyone in your position should." Getting Two Rivers to the cabin took nearly an hour. Sarah supported as much of his weight as she could, and he leaned on her heavily, his breathing labored with each step. The snow helped in one way. Their tracks would be visible, but Sarah knew how to obscure a trail. Her father had taught her that too. They reached the cabin just as the first hint of grey touched the eastern sky. Sarah got Two Rivers down into the cellar, a space her father had dug deep into the earth to store vegetables and preserved food through the winter. It was cold but dry, and most importantly, it was hidden beneath a trapdoor in the kitchen that was concealed under a braided rug and a heavy table. She brought down blankets, more food, water, and her mother's medical supplies. Two Rivers had already collapsed onto the earthen floor, his strength completely spent. "Stay quiet no matter what you hear," Sarah warned. "If the soldiers come, and they will, don't make a sound. Not a breath. Do you understand?" "I understand," Two Rivers whispered. His eyes were already closing. "Thank you, Sarah, for giving me a chance to see one more sunrise." Sarah climbed back up, closed the trapdoor, and arranged the rug and table carefully over it. Then she went outside and used a pine branch to sweep away the tracks leading from the wagon to her cabin, creating false trails that led in different directions into the forest. By the time she finished, the sun was beginning to rise over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. It would have been beautiful if Sarah's heart wasn't pounding with fear. She went back inside, washed the dirt and blood from her hands, and started preparing breakfast as if it were any normal morning. She put coffee on the stove, sliced bread, tried to make everything look ordinary and innocent. That's when she heard them. The sound of horses, many of them, approaching fast through the morning air. Sarah walked to the window and looked out. At least 20 soldiers on horseback were surrounding her cabin, forming a tight circle. At their head rode a man in an officer's uniform, his posture rigid and his face as cold as the Montana winter. Captain Edmund. Thorne had arrived, and he was looking directly at her cabin door with eyes that promised violence. Sarah forced herself to breathe slowly as she watched the soldiers form a perimeter around her property. 20 men, all armed, all watching her cabin with the intensity of hawks circling prey. She'd never seen so many soldiers this far from the fort, and their presence here surrounding a lone girl's home told her everything she needed to know about how seriously they took Two Rivers' escape. The knock on her door, when it came, was hard enough to rattle the frame. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, checked her reflection in the small mirror by the door to make sure she looked calm, and opened it. Captain Thorne stood on her porch, flanked by 2 sergeants. Up close, he was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with pale blue eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they looked at. His uniform was immaculate despite the long ride, and his boots shone with fresh polish. Miss Mitchell, I presume. His voice was smooth, educated, with an accent that spoke of eastern cities, not western territories. Yes, sir. Sarah Mitchell. Can I help you? Captain Edmund Thorne, Fort Sullivan. I apologize for the early intrusion, but we have an urgent situation. He gestured past her into the cabin. May we come inside? It's rather cold out here. It wasn't really a question. Sarah stepped aside, and Thorne entered with his 2 sergeants, their eyes immediately scanning every corner of her small home. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her expression neutral and polite. Coffee, Captain. I just made a fresh pot. How civilized, Thorne said with a thin smile. Yes, thank you. Sarah poured 4 cups with hands that she willed not to shake. The table sat exactly where she'd placed it over the trapdoor. Beneath her feet, separated by only a few inches of wood and earth, 2 rivers lay hidden. One wrong move, one suspicious sound, and it would all be over. Thorne accepted his coffee and remained standing, his eyes never still. You live here alone, Miss Mitchell? Yes, sir. Since my parents passed last winter, that must be very difficult. Very lonely. He paused. And dangerous, I would think. A young woman, isolated, no protection. All sorts of unsavory elements roaming these mountains. I manage, sir. My father taught me how to take care of myself. I'm sure he did. Thorne took a sip of coffee, his eyes still roaming. Tell me, Miss Mitchell, did you hear or see anything unusual last night? Any sounds? Movement near your property? Sarah had prepared for this question during the long hour spent dragging 2 rivers through the snow. I heard wolves, Captain. They were howling pretty close. Kept me up for a while. Why? Has something happened? A prisoner escaped from our custody. A dangerous native warrior being transported to the fort for trial. His wagon was found abandoned about 200 yards from here. Chains broken. Thorne's eyes locked onto hers. And yet you heard nothing. No sound of metal being struck. No voices? The wind was fierce last night, Captain. And the wolves were loud. If there were other sounds, I didn't hear them over the noise. One of the sergeants, a heavy-set man with a scarred face, spoke up. Captain, permission to search the property? Granted, Sergeant Morrison. Thorne set down his coffee cup. Miss Mitchell won't mind, will you? After all, if this dangerous man is hiding nearby, you'd want to know. For your own safety. Of course, Captain. Search wherever you need to. The next 20 minutes were the longest of Sarah's life. Soldiers moved through her cabin like a swarm of locusts, opening cabinets, checking under the bed, pulling aside curtains. They searched her parents' old bedroom, the small storage room, even climbed into the attic. Outside, she could hear more soldiers searching the barn, the woodshed, every outbuilding on the property. Captain Thorne remained in the kitchen, watching Sarah with those cold, calculating eyes. She forced herself to sit calmly at the table, sipping her coffee, trying to look like a young woman with nothing to hide, instead of someone harboring an escaped prisoner beneath her feet. Tell me about your parents, Thorne said conversationally. How did they die? Pneumonia, sir. The doctor from town couldn't reach us in time because of the snow. And no other family? No brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles? No, sir. Just me now. That's very sad. Thorne didn't sound sad at all. This is valuable land, you know. Good water source, protected valley. The railroad is considering a route through this area. You could make a considerable sum if you sold. I'm not interested in selling, Captain. This is my home. Of course. Though I wonder how long a young woman alone can maintain a homestead this size. His tone remained pleasant, but there was steel underneath. Accidents happen in the wilderness. People disappear. It would be unfortunate if something happened to you. Sarah met his eyes directly. Are you threatening me, Captain? Threatening? My dear Miss Mitchell, I'm expressing concern for your welfare. There's a dangerous fugitive loose in these mountains, a man who wouldn't hesitate to hurt a defenseless young woman. Then I'm sure you and your men will capture him quickly. Sergeant Morrison returned from searching the cabin. Nothing, Captain. Place is clean. Check the floor. Look for loose boards, hidden spaces. Sarah's pulse spiked, but she kept her face calm. Morrison got down on his hands and knees, pressing against floorboards, testing them for give. He worked methodically, moving from the entrance toward the kitchen. Sarah could only sit and watch, her coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. Morrison reached the table. He looked up at Thorne. This table, Captain, it's positioned oddly. Right in the center of the kitchen instead of against the wall. Is it? Thorne turned his pale eyes on Sarah. Why is your table there, Miss Mitchell? Sarah's mind raced. The light, sir. That spot gets the best sunlight through the window when I'm doing mending or reading. My mother always kept it there. I see. Thorne gestured. Sergeant Morrison moved the table. This was it. Sarah's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. If they found the cellar door, if Two Rivers made a sound, if they discovered the fresh scratches on the trap door where she'd moved it. Morrison grabbed one end of the heavy oak table and started to pull. It scraped across the floor with a sound like grinding teeth. Sarah held her breath, praying silently to every god she could think of. The table moved 3 feet, revealing the braided rug beneath. Morrison looked at the rug, then at Thorne. Just a rug, Captain. Lift it. Morrison pulled back the rug. The floorboards beneath looked old and settled, with no obvious sign of a trapdoor. Sarah's father had built the cellar entrance carefully, fitting the door so precisely that unless you knew exactly where to look, it was nearly invisible. Morrison pressed against the boards, testing them. He moved across the area where the cellar door lay hidden, his fingers probing for any sign of a gap or weakness. Sarah could barely breathe. Two Rivers was directly below him, separated only by 2 inches of wood. Well? Thorne demanded. Seems solid, Captain. No hidden spaces I can find. Thorne stared at the floor for a long moment, then at Sarah. She met his gaze without flinching, even though her heart was hammering so hard she thought everyone in the room must hear it. Very well, Thorne said finally. Put the table back. Morrison replaced the rug and shoved the table back into position. Sarah released her breath slowly, careful not to show her relief. Thorne finished his coffee and set the cup down with deliberate precision. Thank you for your hospitality, Miss Mitchell. I apologize for the inconvenience. No trouble at all, Captain. I hope you find your prisoner. Oh, we will. Thorne moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. One more thing. The man we're hunting, his name is Two Rivers. He's wanted for several serious crimes, including theft from the fort and conspiracy. If you should see him or hear anything suspicious, you'll report it immediately to Fort Sullivan. Won't you? Of course, Captain. Good. Because harboring a fugitive is a hanging offense, Miss Mitchell. For anyone, even young women living alone. He smiled, and it was the coldest expression Sarah had ever seen. I'd hate for anything unfortunate to happen to you. With that, he left. Sarah stood in the doorway and watched as the soldiers mounted their horses and rode away, spreading out to search the surrounding forest. She waited until they were completely out of sight before allowing herself to sag against the doorframe. Her legs suddenly weak. She'd done it. She'd lied to a U.S. Army captain, hidden an escaped prisoner, and somehow convinced them to leave. But this wasn't over. Thorne suspected something. She could see it in his eyes. He would be watching her now, waiting for her to make a mistake. Sarah waited another hour until she was absolutely certain no soldiers remained nearby. Then she moved the table aside, lifted the trapdoor and climbed down into the cellar. Two Rivers looked at her like she'd lost her mind. You would do this? Risk your life, your home, everything, to help me reach Helena. What else can we do? Sarah asked. If we stay here, eventually Thorne will find you. And when he does, he'll kill both of us to keep his secret safe. Our only chance is to expose him first. You should not have to run. This is your home. My home won't mean anything if I'm dead, or if I have to live knowing I let an innocent man die because I was too afraid to help." Sarah squared her shoulders. "We leave tomorrow night. That gives you one more day to rest and regain strength. I'll gather supplies, prepare everything we need. The moon will be waning, which means darker nights, harder for Thorn's patrols to spot us." "This is insane," Two Rivers said, but there was something like hope flickering in his dark eyes. "Probably," Sarah agreed, "but it's the best plan we have." She climbed back up the ladder, leaving Two Rivers in the cellar with food and water. As she emerged into the kitchen, she heard horses again, just two this time, approaching slowly. Sarah looked out the window and felt her stomach drop. It was Sergeant Morrison and another soldier, walking their horses around her property, clearly watching. Thorn had left guards. They were prisoners in her own home, and the net was drawing tighter with every passing hour. Sarah spent the day moving around her cabin like everything was normal, very acutely aware of the two soldiers watching from the tree line. She fed the chickens, carried water from the well, even did some mending on the porch, all while her mind raced through the supplies they would need for a mountain crossing in November. The temperature was dropping steadily. Snow had begun falling again around noon, light at first, then heavier as afternoon faded toward evening. Good for covering tracks, Sarah thought, but dangerous for travel. The mountain passes could become impassable in a matter of hours during a serious storm. When darkness finally fell, Sarah lit her lamps and moved about the cabin, making sure her silhouette was visible through the windows. She wanted Morrison and his companion to see her following her normal evening routine, eating supper, reading by lamplight, preparing for bed. Just another lonely girl settling in for another long Montana night. At 10 o'clock, she extinguished the lamps and waited in the darkness. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see a small campfire flickering in the distance. Morrison and the other soldier had made camp about 100 yards from her cabin, close enough to watch, but far enough to avoid the cold wind that swept down from the mountains. Sarah waited another hour, until the fire burned low and she could hear faint sounds of snoring. Then she moved. She opened the cellar door as quietly as possible and descended into the darkness. Two Rivers was waiting, already on his feet. He looked stronger than yesterday, his eyes clearer, though he still moved stiffly. "The soldiers," he whispered. "Asleep, I think. But we need to move fast and quiet." Sarah had prepared 2 packs earlier, hidden beneath a pile of old quilts in the cellar. She handed one to Two Rivers. "Food for 5 days, blankets, matches, my father's spare hunting knife. Can you carry it?" Two Rivers hefted the pack. "Yes, you have planned well. My father taught me. He said the wilderness doesn't care about your intentions, only your preparation." Sarah shouldered her own pack, lighter than Two Rivers, but still containing everything she thought essential. "We go out through the root cellar's emergency exit." Two Rivers looked confused until Sarah pulled aside a shelf to reveal a narrow tunnel her father had dug years ago, an escape route in case of fire or attack. It was barely wide enough for a person to crawl through and opened into a dense thicket of pines 50 yards behind the cabin, completely hidden from Morrison's camp. They crawled through the tunnel, the frozen earth scraping against their clothes. Sarah emerged first, checking carefully to make sure no soldiers were nearby. The night was dark and quiet, with only the whisper of falling snow and the distant murmur of the creek. Two Rivers crawled out behind her, and together they moved through the pines like shadows, heading east toward the mountains. Sarah navigated by memory, and the faint landmarks visible in the darkness, a distinctive rock formation, a lightning-split tree, the shape of the peaks against the stars. They'd been walking for perhaps an hour when Two Rivers suddenly grabbed her arm, pulling her down behind a fallen log. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat, but she stayed silent, following his gaze. Through the trees ahead, a light bobbed and swayed. A torch and voices getting closer. "A waste of time," someone was saying. "Girl's probably asleep." "Nothing's going to happen tonight. Captain's orders." That was Morrison's voice. "We check the cabin every 2 hours. If the prisoner tries to make contact with her, we need to know." The patrol passed within 20 feet of where Sarah and Two Rivers lay hidden in the snow. Sarah pressed her face against the frozen ground, not daring to breathe. If they'd brought dogs, if Morrison had decided to do a wider sweep, if they'd seen the tracks leading from the cabin. But the patrol continued on, the light fading back toward her property. Sarah and Two Rivers waited another 10 minutes before moving again, this time more carefully, keeping to rocky ground and places where the wind had blown snow clear, minimizing their trail. The terrain grew steeper as they climbed. Sarah's legs burned with effort, and her breath came in ragged gasps. Behind her she could hear Two Rivers struggling as well, though he never complained. The wind picked up as they gained elevation, cutting through their clothes like knives. They reached the first pass, just as dawn began to grey the eastern sky. Sarah found a small cave, really just a deep overhang of rock, and they huddled inside out of the wind. Two Rivers collapsed against the stone wall, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Rest," Sarah said. "We can't travel during daylight anyway. Too easy to spot." She pulled out dried meat and hardtack from her pack, and they ate in silence. The cave offered some protection, but it was still brutally cold. Sarah could see her breath in thick clouds, and her fingers were numb despite her gloves. "Tell me about Helena," Two Rivers said after a while. "You have been there?" "Twice with my father. It's big, loud, full of people from all over. Miners, merchants, gamblers. The Territorial Marshal's office is on Main Street, a brick building with a flag outside." Sarah smiled at the memory. "My father said Helena was proof that civilization was coming to Montana, for better or worse." "And you think this Marshal Grant will help us?" "I think he's our only chance. Thorne has too much influence at Fort Sullivan. But the Marshal answers to the Territorial Governor, not the Army. If we can reach him, tell him what you know." "If," Two Rivers repeated. That is a very small word carrying a very large weight. They slept in shifts, one always watching while the other rested. Sarah took the first watch, sitting at the cave entrance and scanning the valley below. From this height, she could see her cabin in the distance, a small dark square against the white landscape. Smoke rose from Morrison's camp. Were they panicking yet? Had they discovered her missing? As the sun climbed higher, Sarah spotted movement near her property, soldiers on horseback, at least a dozen, spreading out in a search pattern. She'd known they would come, but seeing it made her chest tighten. There was no going back now. Her home, everything her parents had built, was lost to her until this was resolved. When darkness fell again, they continued climbing. The path grew more treacherous, winding between sharp rocks and along cliff edges, where one wrong step meant a fatal fall. Sarah's muscles screamed in protest, and several times she nearly turned back, convinced they'd never make it. But every time doubt crept in, she thought of Two Rivers chained in that wagon, left to die. She thought of Thorne's cold eyes and the casual way he'd threatened her. She thought of the families on the reservation, going hungry because corrupt officers had stolen their supplies. On the second night, as they crossed a narrow ridge, Two Rivers suddenly stopped. "Someone is following us." Sarah spun around, searching the darkness behind them. "Are you sure?" "I have been watching for the last hour. There, see that light? It disappears, then reappears. Someone with a torch, trying to hide but not quite succeeding." Sarah's heart sank. "How many?" "Hard to say. At least 3, maybe more. They are good trackers, better than Morrison's men." Native trackers, Sarah realized. Thorne must have hired scouts from other tribes. Yes, men desperate enough to work for him despite what he has done. Or men who do not know the truth. Two Rivers' voice was heavy. "We cannot outrun them. Not in my condition and not in this terrain." "Then what do we do?" Two Rivers looked around, assessing their position. They stood on a narrow ridge with steep drops on either side. Behind them, the path they'd taken. Ahead, the trail wound down into a valley before climbing again toward the next pass. "We set a trap," Two Rivers said. "Or rather, we make them think we did." "I don't understand." "The trackers following us are good, but they are also cautious. If they think we have prepared an ambush, they will slow down, proceed carefully. That buys us time." Two Rivers pointed to a cluster of boulders ahead. "We leave obvious signs there. Broken branches, fresh tracks leading behind the rocks. They will think we are hiding, waiting to attack. While they approach carefully, we continue moving. Will it work?" "For a while. Maybe long enough." Two Rivers met her eyes. "But eventually they will catch us, Sarah. We are too slow and they are too skilled." When that happens, we deal with it," Sarah interrupted. "One problem at a time." "That's what my father always said." They set the false ambush quickly, making their presence obvious, then circled around and continued down into the valley. Sarah kept glancing back, watching for lights, listening for sounds of pursuit. The snow had stopped, and the moon broke through the clouds, casting silver light across the landscape. In different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. The mountains rose around them like giants, their peaks gleaming white against the star-filled sky. The air was so cold and clear it almost hurt to breathe. Sarah had never felt so small, so aware of how vast and indifferent the wilderness truly was. They reached the valley floor as dawn approached, and Sarah's legs were shaking with exhaustion. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but two rivers urged her forward. Just a little further. There is a place ahead, near the old trapper's cabin. We can hide there during daylight. How do you know about a trapper's cabin? I scouted this territory for 2 years before Thorn arrived. I know every trail, every shelter, every water source within 50 miles. He paused, breathing hard. That knowledge is why Thorn wanted me working for him, and why he wants me dead now that I refused. They found the cabin just as the sun broke over the eastern peaks. It was barely standing. 3 walls and half a roof, abandoned years ago and slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But it offered shelter from the wind, and a place to hide from eyes scanning the valley. Sarah collapsed against the remaining wall, too tired to even remove her pack. Two Rivers sank down beside her, his face grey with pain and exhaustion. The journey was taking a worse toll on him than he'd admit. "Let me see your wrists," Sarah said. Two Rivers hesitated, then extended his hands. The manacles were still there, the metal cutting into his skin with every movement. The wounds had begun to fester, red and angry-looking. Sarah pulled out her mother's medical supplies and began cleaning them as gently as she could. "This is going to get infected if we don't remove these chains," she said. "I know, but without proper tools," Two Rivers shrugged. "I have survived worse. That doesn't mean you should have to." As Sarah worked, Two Rivers watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Why are you really doing this?" he asked quietly. "You could have let the soldiers take me. You could have stayed safe in your cabin. Instead, you risk everything, your home, your life, your future, for a stranger, for someone your people have been taught to fear." Sarah paused, considering the question. "My father used to tell me a story," she said finally, "about a time when he was young, traveling through unfamiliar territory in the middle of winter. He got lost, his horse went lame, and he was sure he was going to freeze to death. Then a native family found him. They didn't speak his language, and he didn't speak theirs. But they took him in anyway, fed him, cared for him, helped him get home. He said they saved his life for no other reason than because it was the right thing to do." She met Two Rivers' eyes. "He told me that story to teach me something important, that kindness doesn't have borders or conditions, that we're all just human beings trying to survive in a harsh world, and the only thing that separates us from animals is our ability to choose compassion over fear." Sarah finished wrapping his wrists with clean cloth. "So I guess I'm doing this because my father taught me that some things matter more than safety. Things like honor and justice, and not letting innocent people die when you have the power to help them." Two Rivers was quiet for a long moment. "Your father was a wise man. I wish I could have known him." "He would have liked you," Sarah said softly. "He always said you could judge a person's character by how they behaved when things were hardest. You've been beaten, chained, hunted, forced to run for your life. But you haven't become cruel or bitter. That takes real strength. Or perhaps just stubbornness," Two Rivers said with a faint smile. They took turns keeping watch again, though Sarah found it almost impossible to stay awake. Her body was demanding rest, and the relative shelter of the cabin made it hard to resist. She was dozing off during her watch when Two Rivers' hand on her shoulder jolted her alert. "They are coming," he whispered, "faster than I expected." Sarah looked down the valley and felt her stomach drop. At least 5 riders were approaching, moving quickly despite the rough terrain. And at their head, unmistakable even at this distance, rode Captain Thorn himself. "He came personally," Sarah breathed. "Why would he risk that?" "Because this has become personal for him," Two Rivers said grimly. "I embarrassed him by escaping. You embarrassed him by lying to his face and helping me. Men like Thorn cannot tolerate being made to look foolish. What do we do?" Two Rivers looked around the ruined cabin, assessing their options. "We cannot outrun them. Not anymore. My strength is nearly gone and you are exhausted." He met her eyes. "But we can make them work for it. Buy time, create difficulties. The closer we get to Helena, the less comfortable Thorn will be operating." "How far are we from Helena?" "Perhaps 30 miles. In good conditions, a day's hard travel. In our condition, he shrugged. 30 miles might as well have been 300. Sarah felt despair creeping in, cold and heavy. They'd come so far, risked so much, and it was all going to end in this abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere. Then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Bells, faint but distinct. Coming from the north, what is that? Sarah asked. Two Rivers' expression changed, hope flickering across his face. A freight wagon. Maybe more than one. There is a trail that runs north-south through this valley, connecting the mining camps to the main road. He gripped Sarah's arm. If we can reach that trail, flag down those wagons. They looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. It was a desperate gamble. The trail was at least a quarter-mile away across open ground. Thorne's riders would see them the moment they broke from cover. But it was their only chance. We run, Sarah said. As fast as we can. Don't stop, don't look back. Just run! They burst from the cabin and sprinted across the valley floor. Behind them, Sarah heard shouts. Thorne's men had spotted them. The sound of galloping horses followed, getting closer with terrifying speed. Sarah's lungs burned as she ran, her pack bouncing painfully against her back. Two Rivers was beside her, running despite his injuries, despite his exhaustion. The bells grew louder. They were getting closer. A rifle shot cracked across the valley. Sarah flinched but kept running. Another shot, then another. But Thorne was shooting from horseback at moving targets. The odds of him hitting them were low, unless he got lucky. They crested a small rise, and Sarah saw them. 3 freight wagons pulled by oxen, moving slowly along a rutted trail. Men walked alongside the wagons, armed with rifles. Freighters, tough men who made their living transporting goods through dangerous territory. Sarah waved her arms frantically. "Help, please, help us!" One of the freighters saw them and raised his rifle, not in greeting but in warning. They thought Sarah and Two Rivers were bandits or threats. "Please," Sarah screamed. "We're being chased by soldiers. We need help." Behind them, Thorne's riders were closing fast. Sarah could hear the thunder of hooves, feel the ground shaking. 20 more yards. 10. The lead freighter, an older man with a white beard, made a decision. "Get behind the wagons, move!" Sarah and Two Rivers dove behind the middle wagon, just as Thorne's men came into view. The freighters formed a line, rifles raised, creating a barrier between the fugitives and their pursuers. Thorne reined in his horse 20 yards away, his face dark with fury. "Those two are escaped prisoners. Surrender them immediately." The white-bearded freighter spat tobacco juice into the snow. "Don't see no badges. Don't see no warrant. What I see is a bunch of armed men chasing a girl and an injured man through the wilderness." He gestured with his rifle. "Don't much care for that, whoever you are. I'm Captain Edmund Thorne, Fort Sullivan. That man is wanted for crimes against the United States Army. Then take him to a judge and let the law handle it proper. But you ain't taking him from us at gunpoint. Not without a fight." Thorne's hand moved toward his pistol, but the freighter's rifles came up in unison. There were 6 of them, all experienced fighters, all with the high ground and cover. Thorne's men shifted nervously in their saddles. For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Sarah held her breath, certain that bullets were about to fly. Then Thorne's jaw tightened and he turned his horse. "This isn't over," he said coldly. "Not by a long shot." He and his men rode away, disappearing back the way they'd come. But Sarah knew he was right. It wasn't over. He would find another way, another opportunity. The white-bearded freighter lowered his rifle and turned to Sarah and Two Rivers. "Name's Jacob Drummond. Now suppose you tell me what the hell is going on, and why I just made an enemy of a U.S. Army captain." Jacob Drummond's freight camp was set up in a sheltered hollow, a mile north of where they'd met. 6 wagons formed a loose circle, with campfires burning, and the smell of coffee strong in the cold air. The freighters were a rough group, weathered men who'd spent years hauling goods through some of the most dangerous territory in Montana, but they treated Sarah with rough courtesy, and Two Rivers with cautious respect. Sarah sat near one of the fires, wrapped in a borrowed blanket and nursing a cup of hot coffee that tasted like the finest thing she'd ever drunk. Her hands were still shaking from the adrenaline, and every muscle in her body ached. Across the fire, Two Rivers was having his wounds tended by a freighter named Henderson, who claimed to have some medical experience. Drummond settled onto a log beside Sarah, his weathered face thoughtful. "All right, girl. Start from the beginning. And don't leave nothing out. I need to know what kind of trouble I just bought into." Sarah took a deep breath and told him everything, finding Two Rivers chained in the wagon, hiding him in her cellar, Captain Thorne's threats, the reason Thorne wanted Two Rivers dead. She told him about the stolen supplies, the corruption at Fort Sullivan, their desperate flight through the mountains. When she finished, Drummond was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. The other freighters had gathered around to listen, their expressions growing darker as the story unfolded. "That's a serious accusation," Drummond said finally. "Claiming an army captain is stealing supplies meant for the reservation. You got any proof beyond this man's word?" "I have names and dates," Two Rivers spoke up, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "I worked as a scout for Fort Sullivan for 2 years. I know how the supply system works, when shipments arrive where they should go. For the past 2 months, I have been keeping track of every discrepancy. Food that arrives at the fort but never reaches the reservation. Blankets that disappear from inventory. Medicine that is lost in transit, but later appears for sale in mining camps. Still just your word against his," one of the other freighters pointed out. "Not quite," Henderson said, finishing his work on Two Rivers' wrists. "I was at Fort Sullivan 3 weeks ago delivering goods. Saw something interesting in the supply office. Manifest sheets that didn't match the actual inventory. Thought it was strange at the time, but figured it wasn't my business." He looked at Two Rivers. "What you're saying makes sense of what I saw." Drummond rubbed his bearded chin. "Even so, taking this to the territorial marshal is risky. Thorne's got friends in high places. Officers protect each other, army or not." "Then what do you suggest?" Sarah asked, hearing the desperation in her own voice. "We can't just let him get away with this. People are suffering because of his greed." "Didn't say we should let him get away with it," Drummond corrected. "Said it's risky." "There's a difference." He stood up, brushing snow from his pants. "My freight company has contracts with Fort Sullivan, which means I have access to their supply records. If what you're saying is true, those records will show the discrepancies. That's real evidence, not just someone's word." "You would help us?" Two Rivers asked, surprise evident in his voice. "I've hauled freight through this territory for 20 years, Drummond said. "Worked with native scouts, traded with tribes. Seen good people on both sides trying to make a life in hard country. I've also seen my share of corrupt bastards using their power to get rich off other people's suffering." His expression hardened. "I don't hold with that. Never have. When do we leave for Helena?" Sarah asked. "We don't," Drummond said. "At least not right away. Thorne's going to be watching the trails, looking for you to make a run for the territorial capital. He'll have men positioned at every major crossing, every town between here and there." He gestured toward the wagons. "But he won't be watching for my freight train. We're due in Helena in 4 days with a load of mining equipment. You two can ride in one of the covered wagons. Thorne's men might stop us, might even search, but they'll be looking for 2 people on foot or horseback, not passengers hidden in a legitimate freight shipment." Sarah felt hope surge through her exhaustion. "You'd really do that? Already decided, haven't I?" Drummond smiled. "Besides, I want to see Thorne's face when his corruption gets exposed. Man like that has been needing a comeuppance for a long time." The next 3 days passed in a blur of cold, discomfort, and constant tension. Sarah and Two Rivers rode in the back of Drummond's lead wagon, hidden among crates of mining equipment and covered with canvas tarps. The wagon jolted and swayed over rough trails, and the temperature inside was barely warmer than outside. But it was safer than trying to travel on foot. True to Drummond's prediction, they were stopped twice by army patrols. Sarah held her breath each time, listening to the muffled conversations outside, certain they'd be discovered. But Drummond's papers were in order. His freight company was well known and respected, and the soldiers seemed more interested in getting out of the cold than conducting thorough searches. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Sarah heard a change in the sounds outside. More voices, more activity. The creak of other wagons and the bustle of a busy street. Drummond's voice called out, "Welcome to Helena, folks. Last stop on this particular journey." Sarah and Two Rivers emerged from their hiding place stiff and sore, blinking in the sudden brightness. Helena spread out before them, a sprawling frontier town that had grown wealthy on gold and silver. Buildings lined wide streets, some built of brick and stone that spoke of permanence and prosperity. People moved everywhere, miners, merchants, families, natives, Chinese workers, a chaotic mix of humanity drawn by the promise of opportunity. Territorial Marshal's office is 3 blocks that way, Drummond said, pointing. Big brick building, can't miss it. But you might want to clean up a bit first. You look like you've been living in a wagon for 3 days. Because we have been, Two Rivers said with the faint smile Sarah had come to recognize. Drummond provided them with water to wash and clean clothes from his personal supplies. Sarah changed in the back of the wagon, transforming from a filthy, exhausted fugitive into something resembling a respectable young woman. Two Rivers' borrowed clothes didn't fit perfectly, but they were clean and made him look less like an escaped prisoner. As they prepared to leave, Henderson approached with a leather satchel. "A supply manifests from Fort Sullivan," he said quietly. "I may have borrowed some copies during my last delivery. Thought they might come in handy someday." He handed the satchel to Two Rivers. "Show these to the marshal. They'll back up everything you're saying." Two Rivers took the satchel with something like reverence. "Thank you. All of you. You have risked much for people you barely know." "That's how it's supposed to work," Drummond said gruffly. "People helping people. Doing what's right instead of what's easy." He shook Two Rivers' hand, then Sarah's. "Good luck. And when this is all over, if you need work or a place to stay, you come find me. Always got room for folks with courage." Sarah and Two Rivers made their way through Helena's crowded streets toward the marshal's office. Sarah felt exposed and vulnerable after days of hiding, certain that every person they passed was looking at them, recognizing them. But the reality was that in a busy frontier town, 2 more strangers barely rated a second glance. The Territorial Marshal's office was exactly as Sarah remembered, a solid brick, building with the flag of the United States, and the Montana Territory flying out front. Sarah paused at the door, suddenly nervous. "What if he doesn't believe us?" she asked. "What if Thorne got here first, told his version of the story? Then we show him the evidence and let the truth speak," Two Rivers said. "That is all we can do." They climbed the steps and entered. The interior was warm and bustling with activity. Deputies moved between desks, citizens waited on benches, and the smell of tobacco smoke and coffee filled the air. At the main desk sat a young deputy who looked up as they approached. "Help you folks?" "We need to speak with Marshal Grant," Sarah said. "It's urgent." "It's about corruption at Fort Sullivan." The deputy's expression changed, becoming more guarded. "Marshal Grant isn't here. He's in Butte on official business. Won't be back for at least a week." He studied them more closely. "What's this about Fort Sullivan?" Sarah felt her heart sink. A week. They didn't have a week. Thorne would be searching for them, and eventually, "Then we need to speak with whoever's in charge while he's gone," Two Rivers said firmly. The deputy hesitated, then stood. "Wait here. I'll get Deputy Marshal Crawford." He disappeared through a door, leaving Sarah and Two Rivers standing in the busy office. Sarah noticed people staring at Two Rivers, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed hostility. The manacle scars on his wrists were visible beneath his sleeves, marking him as someone who'd been imprisoned. The door opened again, and a man emerged who made Sarah's breath catch. He was tall and solidly built, probably in his 40s, with graying hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. But it was his eyes that held her, steady, intelligent, and kind. He looked like someone who listened before judging. "I'm Deputy Marshal James Crawford," he said. "My deputy tells me you have information about Fort Sullivan. Why don't you come into my office where we can talk privately?" "I'm Deputy Marshal James Crawford," he said. "My deputy tells me you have information about Fort Sullivan. Why don't you come into my office where we can talk privately?" They followed him into a small office lined with filing cabinets and maps. Crawford gestured to chairs, closed the door, and settled behind his desk. "All right. Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out. I've got time, and I've got coffee if you need it." For the 3rd time, Sarah told the story. But this time she had Two Rivers beside her, confirming details, adding information she didn't know. And this time they had evidence. Henderson's supply manifest spread across Crawford's desk, showing clear patterns of theft and misappropriation. Crawford listened without interrupting, his expression growing grimmer as the story unfolded. When they finished, he was quiet for a long time, studying the documents. "This is serious," he said finally. "If what you're telling me is true, and these manifests suggest it is, we're talking about systematic theft from the government, fraud, and attempted murder to cover it up." He looked at Two Rivers. Captain Thorne claims you're a fugitive, wanted for attacking his men. I attacked no one, Two Rivers said steadily. I was a scout. I did my job well until I saw things I could not ignore. When I tried to report what I had seen, Thorne had me arrested on false charges. He planned to kill me and claim I died trying to escape. And you, Miss Mitchell, Crawford turned to Sarah, Thorne will claim you're an accomplice, that you helped a prisoner escape. That's a serious crime. I know, Sarah said quietly, but I couldn't let an innocent man die. Not when I had the power to help him. Crawford leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. Here's my problem. Thorne is a U.S. Army captain. The Army doesn't like civilians, even territorial marshals, interfering in their business. If I move against him without ironclad evidence, he'll use his military connections to make this disappear. You two will end up in prison or worse, and nothing will change. Sarah felt despair rising. So you won't help us? I didn't say that. Crawford's expression hardened. I said I need ironclad evidence. These manifests are good, but they're not enough. I need witnesses, testimony from people at the fort, documentation that can't be dismissed as forgery or misunderstanding. He stood. Which means I need to go to Fort Sullivan myself, conduct an official investigation. Thorne will know you're coming, Two Rivers warned. He will hide the evidence, intimidate witnesses. Probably, Crawford agreed. Unless I show up unexpectedly with enough deputies to make him think twice about trying anything stupid. He pulled out a map of Montana Territory and spread it on his desk. Fort Sullivan is 3 days' ride from here. If I leave tomorrow morning with, say, 6 deputies and a federal marshal's warrant, I can be there before Thorne has time to cover his tracks completely. What about us? Sarah asked. What do we do? You stay here, both of you, in protective custody until this is resolved. Crawford saw their expressions and raised a hand. Not in jail. In a safe house I use for witnesses in dangerous cases. You'll be guarded, protected, and most importantly, out of Thorne's reach. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than running. Sarah looked at Two Rivers, who nodded slightly. All right, Sarah said. We'll do it your way, Marshal Crawford. Good. Crawford moved to the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Miss Mitchell, what you did took real courage. Not many people would risk everything to help a stranger. Your father would be proud. Tears stung Sarah's eyes unexpectedly. Thank you, Marshal. Crawford arranged for them to be taken to the safe house, a modest building on the edge of town, guarded by 2 armed deputies. It wasn't comfortable, but it was warm and secure. For the first time in days, Sarah felt like she could truly breathe. That night, as she lay in an actual bed for the first time since leaving her cabin, Sarah allowed herself to hope. Maybe Crawford would find the evidence he needed. Maybe Thorne would face justice. Maybe she could go home. But in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered doubt. Men like Thorne didn't go down easy. And they didn't forgive people who tried to expose them. The storm, Sarah sensed, wasn't over yet. It was just gathering strength for one final devastating blow.